I first learned about the Brigham Young University when I was a teenager in South Korea. I remember this, largely because, Brigham Young University always beat the national basketball team of South Korea. Yeah, I'm talking about the teenager story. And yes, I was so impressed all the time. I think a college basketball team came to South Korea, played with the best possible basketball players, but they beat, the national Korean basketball team just, so easily. I'm talking about at least, 30 or 40 point difference. That's so embarrassing. And I thought about Brigham Young, and this is my first time at Brigham Young University, and I was very impressed. And also, this is something for me to definitely remember for many, many years, to enjoy talking with you instead of talking to you about freedom of the press. Freedom of the press has been near and dear to my heart for many years, probably because of my own personal experience, not necessarily as an intellectual exercise. Let me tell you something about my background already. Professor Campbell, gave you all the information that you have every right to know about your speaker. Already you are exercising your First Amendment right, correct? That's right. I am talking about credentialing background. Of course, Professor Campbell and other people have vetted my background. So I am not here as a weird fellow from Pyongyang, North Korea. I have a well-credentialed, naturalized US citizen. Of course, I served in the Korean Army for almost 3 years, 33 months and 15 days in 1974 to 1976. My personal story has a lot to do with what I experienced in South Korea as a freshman in college. In the early 1970s, South Korea was very much a typical authoritarian, economically struggling third world country, essentially. Up to 1985, South Korea was very much a dictatorship. I know some of you might have been to South Korea, but not old enough to know what I'm talking about. But in the past 20 years, South Korea is different. But at least in my case, as a college freshman in South Korea, I was involved in anti-government demonstrations, not really violently, rather mildly, in a gentleman way. But my discreet way of expressing my, how can I say, sort of what, discontent or unhappiness or displeasure with the way the Korean government ruled the Korean people was not acceptable at all. I was essentially drafted overnight for military service. They wanted to teach me Korean democracy 101. It was quite a wonderful learning experience. I'm talking about 33 months and 15 days. Yes. I sometimes want to know why I was picked on by some people. I was sometimes beat up because I was reading Time, Newsweek, and the Reader's Digest. As you know, military lives, are very boring. I tried to find a productive, creative way of using my time, but I was perceived to be reading something suspicious or seditious. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, at the time, anything about North Korea in the foreign newspapers or news magazines was more or less what? Prohibited. I am talking about anti-communism, pervasive of Korean society. I think that was the very beginning of my real serious interest in freedom of the press and the freedom of speech, and more specifically, communication law. But when I first came to the United States, to be brutally honest with you, I did not know much about the First Amendment to the US Constitution. Now I know something about the First Amendment. I know the history. I know how many words are there in the US Constitution. I know the 14 words out of the 45 word First Amendment to the US Constitution. I can recite. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Each and every word, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. Each and every word means something. As you know, our Constitution does not allow any kind of redundancy. No repetition is allowed. Our Constitution is the oldest and the shortest, even though it is 4,440 words. But it is an amazing document. And the reason why we can say we are still proud of our constitutional commitment to freedom of speech, or broadly, to political rights and the civil liberties, is still justified. Yes. Of course, it is a sobering reality. There are some surveys, I am talking about international surveys, of political rights and the civil liberties, and also press freedom. And those surveys are not encouraging to us. Our country is not at the top of the rankings. Not at the top 10 countries. Now, at least the 2006 survey of the Reporters Without Borders, we are ranked number 53. That's just embarrassing, isn't it? You and I know say that ranking is just awfully incorrect. Of course, we can challenge the methodology. But the survey says something about what we are going through. We are talking about the extraordinary implications or ramifications of that kind of evaluation of our supposedly serious commitment to freedom of expression as right. What we are not doing, or what we are failing to do when it comes to our commitment to freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, that kind of failure to live up to the expectations from other people is just amazing. That's why what we are doing in the United States should be a lot more carefully scrutinized. We are not the same with some countries whose commitment to political rights and the civil liberties is usually not really impressive. We are talking about more than 200 years experience. In 1992, Professor Rodney Smalla, he's now the dean of the law school at Washington and Lee. He wrote a wonderful book called Free Speech in an Open Society. In chapter 13, which is titled Toward an International Marketplace of Ideas, he says something which I agree with him. Essentially, she said, the United States cannot provide all the answers to free speech-related questions around the world. But the United States can provide some kind of what direction, largely because we Americans have had more experience with the freedom of speech related challenges. That is definitely correct. But now, 15 years after, there are a lot of books coming out. Actually, I'm going to show you this. Freedom for the thought that we hate. We are not talking about freedom of thought. We are talking about freedom for the thought that we hate. The author of this book is Anthony Lewis. As you probably know, he is one of the most thoughtful newspaper columnists. He was a syndicate columnist for the New York Times from 1969 to 2001. And this is his first book since 1991. In 1991, he published a book called Make No Law. Now you're familiar with Make No Law. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Anyway, in 1991, he published a book called Make No Law, the Sullivan Case and the First Amendment. Sullivan Case is one of the 20 landmark cases of the United States. Essentially, in Sullivan, as in New York Times versus Sullivan of 1964, the Supreme Court of the United States basically said Americans have a right to criticize the government without any kind of consequences. That's extraordinary. That's why some people, like Rodney Smollett, or like the Second Circuit Judge Robert Seck, called a revolution. We don't go through some kind of military revolution, correct? We had only one military revolution. It was kind of civil war. Am I right? That's right. But in 1964, it was kind of a revolution. It was the central meaning of the First Amendment. The First Amendment was ratified in 1791. Americans are privileged to criticize their government without worrying about any possibility that they might be put in jail overnight. That's wonderful. During the past, how many years? 1964 to 2008, 44 years? That's right. That kind of central meaning of the First Amendment is still valid. I say seditious criticism of the government is not a crime at all. Yes. And actually that is what Mr. Anthony Lewis is talking about, at least. But in the past 6 years, I am talking about the post-9/11 America. Sometimes we have to confront the reality. How far can we go in allowing freedom of expression, which we sometimes feel is abused or more often misused by people who we think do not deserve the First Amendment? At least we can say this in a positive way. Our government did not do what our government did during World War II. I am talking about Japanese internment. Yes. Our government did not go that far in arresting Arab Americans, correct? That's right. Even though some isolated cases of racial profiling, but not systematic at all, at least. And also, even though American newspapers are very much comfortable with supporting what the Bush administration has been doing, sometimes almost unanimously, especially in the first few years. But now, as you know, there is a lot more vociferous dissent. And the American news media are willing to push the envelope on what Americans have a right to know. And that kind of reality check is definitely uplifting. We don't have to be overly pessimistic. I am talking about the resilience of American society. But I have to challenge you not to be, how can I say, just accepting what is happening. I am talking about whether what we can say is our exceptionalism in freedom of speech is really as exceptional as you and I might wish, or that is not so exceptional as it should be. I am asking you, actually I am challenging you not to be complacent about what our conventional wisdom sometimes leads us to believe. I cannot discuss everything which might challenge our conventional understanding of freedom of expression. At least I'd like to highlight some of the First Amendment areas which we might rethink in terms of whether we still continue to commit ourselves to serve as sort of a what? So beacon of freedom and hope. Already I said, in the United States, criticism of the government is not a crime. It is a right. That's wonderful. That is making us different from many other people. Yes. But probably that is sort of a minimum as far as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is concerned. I am talking about a functioning democracy. If you are a citizen of a functioning democracy like the United States, you should not be punished for saying something critical of what your government is doing. That is not something we have to always brag about. More importantly, we are talking about some kind of a positive role of the government. And if that role has been really given careful consideration by our government, as I said, our country is not highly ranked in the international global surveys of freedom of expression. For whatever reason, we have to accept that kind of sort of poor evaluation. I don't want to quibble about the methodology, the scope of the surveys, or who did do that. Okay. More importantly, I want to think about what is making our commitment as strong as it should be. First, let me say this. I am talking about access to information issues since 9/11. More information than ever is classified. And the more information which has been declassified is now reclassified. I'm talking about classifying again, even though many people have already the declassified information in their what? Computer files. And sometimes it is silly, but still too cautious in just letting the public know and they decide whether that is relevant to their informative understanding of what the government is doing. At least in our country, the right to know is not part of our Constitution. Right to know means whether we have the right to demand access to government documents. If it is part of freedom of speech and the freedom of the press under our Constitution, we can demand it. But it is not part of our constitutional right. Significantly, in other countries, it is accepted as a human right and as a constitutional right. A broad understanding, conceptual understanding of people's right to know. Sure, we can say this, freedom of speech and the freedom of the press means right to express ourselves. Not necessarily asking for the government for information. Because asking the government for information has something to do with what? Just what? Helping. I think asking the government to help with information gathering. So a little bit different way to look at. And that kind of narrow understanding of freedom of expression under our Constitution is sometimes affecting the basic understanding of why the government wants to limit the public access to information rather than broaden the information. And there is something interesting, I say, in contrast with what we are doing. I am talking about the international courts. Especially, I am talking about Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Rather recently, actually, that is what I mentioned in my op-ed piece. Inter-American Court of Human Rights recognized the public's right to know as a human right. It is not supposed to be quibbled about or tampered with by some kind of a constitutional guarantees or lack of guarantees. There's sometimes amazing development. Yeah. Congress passed the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, in 1966. Yes. So about 4 years ago. It was one of the first freedom of information laws specifically passed by legislatures in the world. But I have to remind you, our country was actually 200 years later than Sweden. Yes. Sweden passed their Freedom of Information Act in 1766. That's amazing. We are talking about people's right to know. Well before the United States came into existence on earth, they already recognized the public's right to know. That's very important. American government, our government is less, positive about the public's right to know, especially in the past several years. It has a lot to do with the 9/11 impact. Yes. But the fundamental question is, just because people know more than they should, does it create some kind of national crisis? Government officials, not only in the United States, but many other countries say the public should not know too much. But the question is, what is too much? At least our human history proves irrefutably that no country has been destroyed by the public who knows too much about their government. No country has been undermined by a free press which has been challenging the sometimes overbearing, intrinsically secret-oriented government functionaries. And at least there is the vision of our forefathers, our constitutional framers. Our constitutional framers were not timid, were not diffident people. They knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to do some kind of experiment, trusting in the human instinct or human nature. If they were given a chance to know what they were doing without being overly impeded in their decision-making process by the government, things will work out fine. Yes. One clear-cut example has a lot to do with what the Bush administration did as compared with the Clinton administration. By the way, my commentary on the Bush administration has nothing to do with my political persuasion. I am talking as a communication scholar, not as a Republican or Democrat. But the important thing is the Bush administration basically said this after taking over the government. If there is any kind of doubt about a government document which has been requested for disclosure to the public, the information should not be disclosed. This is amazingly sharply different from what the Clinton administration did. Attorney General Janet Reno basically declared, if some documents, as a government agency records, are requested by the public, and the government documents might be withheld from public disclosure because of one or more exemptions of the FOIA. Janet Reno said those documents should be presumptively open. That is giving some idea of how our government's current administration's approach to the public's right to know relating to information. This kind of policy shift relating to the government officers' value judgments on the public's right to know has extraordinary ramifications for the rest of the world. If the United States does this or that, the other countries always say, yes, if the United States this or that, why not us? I am talking about how to limit freedom of expression as a right. That is the extraordinary responsibility of the United States. What we are doing is not necessarily only for ourselves. We are absolutely supreme leader. Yes. I am talking about power, especially relating to democratic politics. And that is why what we are doing, less than what we are supposed to do, it is very likely to exert some kind of negative influence on the rest of the world. That is why we should be a little bit more or extra careful about whether we can do something which we might eventually regret when our passion is not really that kind of passionate at all. I am talking about war-related passion, some kind of a crisis-induced passion. And the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press are most important when the society is undergoing some kind of crisis. Simply because the majority will always, will likely support the government. Simply because there's a human nature. I am talking about survival instinct. But as Professor Vince Blas of Columbia Law School said, when we are going through a crisis, we should be a lot more alert about the fragility of freedom of expression. And actually that is what Mr. Anthony Lewis is talking about in his book. And also that is what Professor Jeffrey Stone of the University of Chicago is talking about in his wonderfully readable book called War and Liberty, published in 2006. So again, we talk about when we should stand up instead of just what? Giving applause to what the government is doing. Sometimes that is what we talk about, the right to know. In connection with the narrowed right to know, I have to mention the journalist privilege. The journalist privilege essentially means news reporters should have a right to protect their confidential sources, especially when they are asked by government authorities. I'm sure you're familiar with the Valerie Plame case. Valerie Plame was a covert CIA operative, and her husband was a former diplomat of the Clinton administration. And he was dispatched to an African nation to find whether Iraq might buy something for making nuclear bombs. He could not find anything. And he challenged President Bush's State of the Union address, which claimed that the Iraqi government was engaged in producing weapons of destruction, weapons of mass destruction. Mr. Wilson, Valerie Plame's husband, wrote an op-ed piece raising questions about some kind of a possible lie, sort of a shenanigan relating to President Bush's address. Miss Valerie Plame's identity was disclosed in an op-ed piece, I say in a column, by a conservative columnist, Mr. Novak, Robert Novak. That was the beginning of when the journalists were asked to provide information about who identified Valerie Plame. I am talking about a violation of federal law relating to keeping the information about the identity of CIA agents secret. Yes. American news reporters were not lucky. They did not have that much luck at all. The federal government's special prosecutor did not hesitate to go after American news reporters who might have had information about who disclosed the identity of Miss Valerie Plame. You might wonder immediately, how could the government demand information which was obtained by bona fide news reporters for their job? They were not gathering information as the government officials. They got the information simply because they were doing their job as reporters. Yes. But now the government was asking them to reveal their sources. You say the First Amendment should have applied to protect those news reporters. And I agree with you. But the American law, I am talking about federal law, was not helpful at all. And as you know, Judy Miller of the New York Times, she's a very controversial reporter, no question about it. And she refused to reveal her source. And she had to pay a high price. She was in jail for, I think, 85 days. That's a lot. Mm-hmm. But the fact that she and other people were subpoenaed by a grand jury to reveal their confidential sources was quite amazing. In 2002, the First Amendment attorney by the name of Floyd Abrams, he argued at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia that journalist privilege should be accepted by international law, citing American court cases, citing Americans' positive experience with the recognition of the journalist privilege. It was in 2002, and actually 2001 as well. But 5 years after, it was not the case. What Floyd Abrams said at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was not exactly the case with American law. Floyd Abrams, some people say, he is a sort of what, paragon of First Amendment law. He published a book in 2005, correct, called Speaking Freely, The Trials of the First Amendment. In his book, he is talking about the specific amazing development outside the US borders, especially in the freedom of the press. Chapter 18 is called At Home and Abroad. Very, very simple chapter. But he is arguing, sort of lamentably or plaintively, basically saying, we have something to learn from other countries. He is talking about some kind of a backtracking, I say retrenchment in our commitment. He is specifically mentioning some cases from the European Court of Human Rights 1996, Goodwin versus United Kingdom, and also the Randall case of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Mr. Jonathan Randall was a Washington Post reporter. He was retired at the time when he was subpoenaed by the International Criminal Tribunal. He wrote an article about, some kind of war in Bosnia, former Yugoslavia. And the person who was prosecuted with crimes against humanity wanted to ask some questions, about his story. Mr. Randall refused to cooperate. Amazingly, as I said, the recognition of the journalist privilege by the judges of the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, was based upon American law. But the American law, which was wonderfully used for recognition of the journalist privilege in international law, was not as widely accepted as it should be in the United States. So it is extreme, it is very ironic. We preach what we don't practice. That is what Mr. Abrams was talking about in his book chapter called At Home and Abroad. You might ask, how many countries recognize the journalist privilege? And if so, how more extensively they do than we do? But as I said, the benchmark for our federal law on the journalist privilege to protect their confidential sources is 0, essentially. And of course, when we talk about state law, if I understand it correctly, I think 35 states recognize journalist privilege. Of course, just about 1 week or so ago, your state, the state of Utah, has adopted the Supreme Court rules in recognition of the journalist privilege. That is a wonderful, promising, uplifting development. That is great. You should be proud of what the Supreme Court justices of the state of Utah are doing. Of course, the news media people and also communication law professors like Professor Joel Campbell and Professor Ed Carter. Their active engagement in pushing for the recognition of the journalist privilege in the state of Utah should be given due credit. That's extremely important. We have to work more on this kind of thing than ever. There are many other things we might look at in terms of whether we can do better. But at least when you and I think about what is making us different from the rest of the world is we have to think a little bit more carefully, a little bit more, how can I say, seriously about what we have been doing. We cannot say other countries are not doing well enough. That is not the point. We have to compare with ourselves. We have to challenge ourselves rather than challenging and comparing with other people. That's not the way to move ourselves to a next level of, I say, excellence in our human rights record. I don't want to give an impression that I am too pessimistic or I am cynical, not necessarily skeptical. But sometimes when we look at our record, I think we have more work to do. I think that's the message I want to leave with you right now.